Trustees, thank you for attending today's lecture. I have some words written down, but I just wanted to mention, last year and year before, we didn't have in-person lecture series indoors. We did do something at the Lighthouse, but I miss this. Being here and looking out and seeing all these faces, people that are interested in local history, and certainly to listen to Tom speak today, it really is inspiring. So, thank you for being here. Much appreciation is extended to NoFo Real Estate, who has generously sponsored this lecture series, and to Southold Town for allowing us to host a lecture series in this large space. Just leaving was Janet Douglas, the Southold Town Rec Center coordinator, and she's really been quite helpful. We're fortunate to be able to host this free of charge. Of course, if you'd like to make a donation to the museum, we won't turn you down. The theme of this winter's lecture series is local farming through the years. On the table in the back, there is some information about the future lectures, as well as general information about the museum, if you're interested. I would mention that directly related to this theme, Southold Historical Museum has been considering curating an exhibit about local labor camps, which is a topic of a future lecture, the one in March. We have a significant archival collection related to these camps. However, we cannot do such an exhibit without the input of the community. So we hope that this lecture series might help us to connect with the people who understand history and the livelihood personally. To that point, I also have a clipboard on that back table with a sheet to share your contact information if you would like, so that we could be in touch with you about future conversations we might have related to that exhibit. Now, the real reason you're here was not to listen to me, I know that. We are very fortunate to have Tom Wickham here today to present the Wickham family's farming tradition. Tom Wickham and his family own Wickham's Fruit Farm in Cutchogue. He's also a former Southold Town supervisor. He did just mention that he's got memories of being in this space when serving, and a research scientist by trade. Tom today will share with us his insight to the Wickham family's long farming tradition, and which actually dates back to the 1600s, so many centuries, as well as what it's like to be a modern-day farmer. So I think we're in for a real treat. And many thanks to you, Tom, for your generosity and willingness to share this story. Without further ado, if you please join me in welcoming Tom Wickham.
Well, I guess this is going to stay where it is. Is this comfortable voice?
Yes.
Farming through the ages and the role of our family and how we play in it and all of the different aspects of it is a huge subject. I tried to prepare for this a little bit today, and there was so much material in it that I thought what I'll do is just skim over parts of it and concentrate a little bit on the last 30 or 40 years that I've been active in it, and then turn it over to you to ask questions. And I'll try to deal with the questions that you ask to the extent I can. But as we go through this afternoon, think about the parts that you would like to have more focus on and more discussion about. Raise your hand afterwards when I'm done, and we'll try to have some time for it. I think better that way than for me to try to cover everything. There's just so much material here. To begin with, yes, as Deanna said, I am farming and have been for the last 35 years here in Cutchogue. A farm that has been in our family for ages and that currently my son actually owns. John, some of you may actually know him. I'm managing it for him. In addition, my wife Yeki also owns part of it, and my sister Arnold were also part owners in it. So I just a bit player, but I am managing the business. I'd like to start really at the beginning of sort of recorded history of this area. And to the extent that it's known, Long Island was formed ages ago, millennia ago, largely by glaciers. Glaciers that moved down from the north, slowly pushing down with enormous weight of accumulated, this, we talk about global warming, this was global cooling. Ice formed on top of ice, pushing itself south like a bulldozer. And then came a period of warming. The ice essentially melted, and it retreated, and the runoff from that pushed the finer soils farther south. It left big rocks, bigger boulders on the north edge, and it pushed the finer soils, washed out the outwash plain to the south. What we have, and it actually did that twice. Once farther to the south, leaving the South Fork, and then later on, not quite as far, leaving the North Fork. That's an oversimplified version of it. There's a lot more that went on in the formation of the soils, but I think basically, in summary, that's the formation of Long Island. And the soils here, and the climate, and the sunlight, and the water are just remarkable for farming. I've traveled a long ways away. I was overseas, as Deanna said, for about 25 years after I graduated, doing agricultural development work in different parts of the world, primarily Asia, but not only Asia. I don't think, of course I'm prejudiced, but I don't think I have seen a more productive agricultural area than Long Island. We have, particularly this part of Long Island, the North Fork, we have more sunlight here than anywhere else in the Northeast United States. Only, I'm like 6 feet something tall. On my farm, if you dig a hole, and I'm at the bottom, it's pure, pristine water. You're standing in water only 6 or 8 feet from the surface of the ground. That's water that's readily pumped up, used for irrigation, used in our homes for drinking water. It's accessible and it's plentiful, and it's clean and pristine so far. The water, sunlight, and the soils. Soils are a little sandy, a little light, but that can be remedied with fertilizer. The water goes through them smoothly. It's just a very productive soil. It's a wonderful environment for farming. People who have been here and come and visit, and the very first settlers who showed up here found this just extraordinary. They could hardly believe such a wonderful, productive environment as we have here on Long Island. And that set the stage for the Indians who lived here first, and then when the first settlers came, first to New England, up in the Boston area, very soon they heard about Long Island. The Indians themselves would tell stories about the burden of wonderful production here on the island. And those stories went up to New England very quickly. Within 10 years, people were coming down towards the southern part of Connecticut, on the rivers, the Connecticut River, the Thames, all of these, to come to Long Island. They chartered boats. They came down, and the more they came to Long Island, the more active, the more excited people were about it. Long Island in those days was essentially wooded. If you want to know what those woods look like, drive along Route 48 in Cutchogue. You'll see a block of woods that's very much like it was back 300 years ago. On the right side going up to the Sound, and on the left side going down to Route 25. That's actually owned by Gail Wickham, my cousin, and part of the Wickham farm at that time. It's still there, some 40 or 50 acres. There are patches of woods here and there, but that's one of the largest blocks that I know of that's really original type woods. The first job that the Indians had was to clear some of this land for their own farming. They did that, and there's one section in Cutchogue that's also part of our farm now called the Broad Fields. And that was land that had been farmed and cleared, and then farmed by the Indians before it settled by the English. And that was about a 300 or 400 acre piece that's partly there by Pequash Avenue, just west of Pequash Avenue, and actually part of our farm now. So we reckon that the farm that we are still farming, it's been in our family for 300 and some years. Before that, for at least 400 years by Indians, so we're looking at over 700 years of continuous farming on some of this most productive land here. Since then, more land was cleared since that time, and one of the first jobs of settlers was to clear land. And that process has gone on right up until the 1900s. When the Irish came here in the early, the mid-1800s, their job was to clear land. And when the Poles came in the early 1900s, you read what they did, and their job also was clearing land for their farms. And over a period of some years, some 150, 200 years, gradually Long Island was cleared of olives and converted into farmland. And most farms had a sawmill. We had a sawmill, and of course it was long before my time, but you all have heard about the hurricane of 1938. I came along just a few months after that hurricane. You couldn't remember it, of course. But we have a sawmill on our farm. And that sawmill was really busy after that hurricane, sawing up a lot of the trees that fell in that hurricane, good oak trees. We made the siding for the old house in Gutterwood from those trees. We made heavy, thick planks that were used on the ferry boats between Greenport and Sheller Island. And that's what farms did. That in clearing land, you use the wood as productively as you can. Most of us had sawmills to do that. That was the beginning of the farming here. The settlers came. The Indians first had a relatively limited number of crops. We believe they had corn, just regular field corn, squash, and a few butternut squash and Hubbard type squash, those kinds of things, and not a whole lot else that we know of. They grew some materials to make clothing from, like flax, things like that. And I think that's pretty much all that they had. It was a pretty limited repertoire of crops that the Indians had. The English, when they came, could hardly believe the crops that they could grow here, and were interested and brought seeds and different kinds of crops that they could grow, and did so quite successfully. There was, of course, competition with the Indians. We can talk more about that later, but I view it as almost inevitable that there would be a serious conflict. Indians were not a nomadic, but a moving group that didn't really have a settled place to live. They would move here, they would clear a spot there, they would move on to other places. Whereas the English would like to settle down. They had property rights the way we think of them today that they wanted to defend. They wanted to establish their communities. And the idea of people just moving in and out, it was just not consistent between those two different groups of people. And as you all know, sooner or later the Indians were basically defeated and were obliged to leave Long Island. And that's a story that we can tell more, that other people know better than I do, but we can talk about it some more later. But it's not a happy story, but it is essentially what happened. So going into the mid-1800s, farming changed a lot when the Long Island Railroad came out to Greenport. That opened up a market in New York City. And the key crop that went to New York was bedding for animals, and in particular horses. This was the period before cars and trucks. It was the period of animal transport, horse and wagon. Those horses and wagons needed bedding and they needed feed in the city. The Long Island Railroad, it was a freight railroad as well as a commuter and a train, and a passenger railroad. And that was a tremendous outlet for marsh grass. You know how the marsh grass grows in our creeks? That was bedding, and also for feed. It came from farms out here. And it was the beginning of a semi-commercial type of farming, not just subsistence as it had been in the beginning. There were other crops that also went to the city and further west, beginning in the mid to late 1800s. And that was a time that potatoes also got started on Long Island. Potatoes were, and still are, a very good crop to grow here. Our conditions for potatoes are almost perfect. We have cool nights, which potatoes like. We have a sandy soil, which also they like, and it doesn't impinge on their growth. Our soils are acidic, which is good because it prevents the diseases that potatoes often get. And, at least on our farm, there are hardly any rocks. The problem with rocks is you can't easily distinguish a rock from a potato when you pick them up in the harvest. The downside was that potatoes are, here on Long Island, are grown in a rather high-cost environment. You all know when you pay your electric bills, and when you pay for people to do things, how costly it is. If you go up to New England, or if you go down to Pennsylvania or elsewhere in the United States, those same items are considerably cheaper. And over the years, Long Island found that although we could grow a wonderful crop of potatoes and get very high yields, not initially, but over the years, the yields got better and better and more productive. We just could not produce them economically. The cost of production were just too much, far higher than potatoes grown in Maine and potatoes grown elsewhere in the United States. And as acreage controls came into being in the United States, acreage controls on wheat and on rice and a whole series of other crops, those farms that went out, that were restricted how much acreage they could grow those crops, increasingly grew potatoes. So potatoes were grown more and more, and Long Island, while we had good production, just could not compete on price. You know, I still remember when I was in high school, it would go through a cycle. And the cycle would go something like this. You'd have a rather bad year. You would lose money. So you plan for next year. Well, what do you do next year? Well, we lost money, but if we could just grow a little bit more potatoes, we could do it more efficiently, and we could maybe make up for it with volume. So the next year, there were even more potatoes on the market. And the price was even worse. And this would go on for 2 or 3 years until the price, I remember one of the worst years after this cycle was the price was only about 65 cents for 100 pounds. 100 pounds of potatoes shipped to New York for 65 cents for 100 pounds. After that, after like 2 or 3 years of that, a lot of the farms were out. They couldn't borrow any more money. They couldn't buy the seed or the fertilizer to do the next year. They were out. Production would be much less. And instead of 65 cents, that next year, the price would be $13 a 100 pounds. And then we'd go through the same cycle again. This went on for at least 20 years, 30 years. And finally, a lot of people got the message. This just is not a productive way to conduct farming. There was still a place for specialized potatoes. There still is. Several of my friends are still growing potatoes. They're successful at it, but they have to find a special market to do it. You can't just throw them on the wholesale market and expect to come out alive. Sooner or later, if you can find a specialized market for it, yes, it can still work. We can grow very good potatoes. The question is to market. My father used to say, you know, you can grow almost anything on Long Island. The problem is to find a market. And that's true. Um, those farms that have gotten out of potatoes more recently have looked for a special niche, a special place, a market for what we're growing that people really want. And I can name a few of them. Some of you may know the Sangley farm here. They're growing organic fruits, organic vegetables. There's a demand for that. People would like to have it. I think they have a successful business. They've also gone through a major change from what they used to be. Many years ago, they were a commercial business similar to potatoes, and they just could not make money either. And they made a switch, and I think they're successful. There are a number of other businesses here on Long Island, farming businesses, that have made a switch and have found a specialized market that works for them. In our case, we felt what we would like to do is to grow, and it was really my father and my mother who together made this shift. Let's start growing fruit. Fruit can, A, there may be a local demand for it, and B, maybe we can sell it retail instead of just throwing it onto a New York commercial market. And that's what we did beginning in the 1950s. We started off with peaches, we added apples, we added other crops, berries and whatnot, and we've been there ever since. We're not exceptionally profitable or exceptionally great at what we're doing. In fact, it's rather difficult because we're trying to grow so many different crops at the same time. I'm always impressed to visit in the Hudson Valley where they grow apples. They are really good at it. They are really good at growing apples. They know just about what to do, when to do it, and how to do it, and they grow a very good crop. I'm actually envious of them because in my case, we're stretched among so different crops, so many different crops, it's kind of hard to do everything exactly as it should be done and when it should be done. But we try. But on the other hand, you can only sell so many peaches during, say, August, and then you're done. You need to grow more different crops if you're going to follow this model. And our model is to try to produce and sell as much good local fruit as we can. There's another downside to growing local fruit and selling it retail, and that is our specialty is to try to grow high quality eating fruit. Well, to get quality, you have had tomatoes that you eat. A lot of the commercial tomatoes that come to New York are actually picked green, put in a tractor trailer, and then with ethylene gas on the whole trip from wherever to New York City. By the time they come to New York, they're all orange. Ethylene will do that. But it was still picked green, and it's still not a really good fresh fruit. You all know fresh fruit from your gardens is really nice. It means, though, picking fruit right, you get losses. It gets bruised. It's less efficient. If you pick stuff green, you can pick the whole plant at one time. If you want to pick it right, you pick the right ones today. 3 or 4 days later, you come in, you pick another few fruit, and then days after that, you do it again. It's not as efficient. It's better. And our market seems to understand that, and it sort of works for us. In our case, we have a retail farm stand. We also have encouraged people to come to pick their own. It's not entertainment farming. We're really not into that, but we do welcome people to come help us harvest our crop. And we bring them out to the orchard. Some of you, I know, have been with us. It's kind of fun for me, and it's an opportunity for them to see what farming is really like. And when we have enough, we do sell a few to specialty grocers here on Long Island who are specifically looking for our product. There are a handful of them. We really can't easily sell to the big chains. We don't have enough, and our prices are probably too high. But there are a handful of specialty grocery shops that really like what we have. We supply them in relatively small quantities. And it's a part of our business when we have enough to do. But it's not only us. There are other farms out here that have adjusted and have made that transition to a higher value type of farming, which we have to do on the island here. I mentioned the difficulty with potatoes because it set the stage for what's happened more recently. Potatoes, what really hurt in the 1970s and 80s, apart from the price thing, were the restrictions that we had on what we can grow. Aldicarb showed up in the groundwater for a while, and with that came the legal inability to use certain agricultural chemicals. And one of those chemicals was one that controlled the Colorado potato beetle. So we were unable to control the beetle. We were not legally allowed to use any spray materials that would work at that time. Since then, there are new materials that you can use and that they do work. But for a while, we were without a defense. And I still remember those years when the potato beetle would come through a potato field and just leave stubs of the potato plant there. No leaves, nothing, and then it would cross a road and they'd go on the other side to the next field. It was extraordinary. But that's what can happen, and that's what happens more when you have a monocrop with only just one crop, which was potatoes at that time. There are two things that I wanted to end this discussion about that have been really important to the preservation and continuation of farming here on Long Island. One of them is technological development, tech. Most people, when you talk about tech, they think about computers or iPhones or something like that. That's tech. Technology is much more than that. Technology is whatever it takes to do a job that needs to be done more efficiently, better, faster, more economically. Tech started out in farming in the just after World War II, with two really important innovations here. One of them was the advent of irrigation. We didn't really have irrigation prior to the war. And after the war came irrigation pipes. Some of you, if you're sort of my age, maybe worked on farms, we all carried irrigation pipe. You lay up the pipe, you have sprinklers, you would irrigate that part of the farm, then you have to move the pipe to the next section of the farm. We had to move pipe. I got paid 10 cents per line that we moved to just lift up that pipe. There is a saying that in technology, pioneers pay twice. What does that mean? The first people who adopt some new change, yes, it's a good idea, but it doesn't work out. And then because there's some part of it that's not ideal. And then later on somebody comes by and improves it, and yes, it really works. Pioneers pay twice. In our case, we bought the first irrigation pipe. It was a galvanized steel pipe, and it was really heavy. And we used that for about 10 years or so, and it was inefficient, and you could hardly lift it. Soon, aluminum pipe came, and that was much more efficient, and we had to buy it a second time. We bought the steel pipe, and we had to go out and again buy another one. But irrigation made a huge difference, particularly for crops like fruit and vegetables, and even potatoes. Potatoes take a lot of water. But that irrigation potential, with the water, with the pumps, with the sprinklers that you see almost every summer out here, has been absolutely critical to the growth and development of what we have here. The second part of technology at the same time was tractors and agricultural machinery. It used to be horses. My father used to say, you know, we're all of us tempted to exaggerate sometimes, but he would say that he could plow by hand behind a horse, a team of horses. He could plow almost as much land in one day, holding the plow and just moving back and forth through the field, as you could with the early tractors. I can tell you, to do that all day long, there's no way that anybody today would be able to do that. Our tractors are bigger now, the plows are bigger, and plowing and tractor work enabled larger farms. They were before rather small. With tractors and agricultural equipment, a farmer could easily look after a farm of, say, 100 to 150 acres without too much difficulty. Without that equipment, a farm of even 30 to 40 acres was, I wouldn't say the limit, but it was really tough to do much more than that with just your own family. That was kind of a game changer. The advent of irrigation at the same time of agricultural machinery. Those two things made farming much more attractive and more productive, and gave more alternatives, more different ways to make money through farming. What kind of technology do we have today? What are the opportunities today for further growth in technological development? There are 2 or 3 things that have been really important and that have continued and are still continuing. We have the Riverhead, the research station in Riverhead. Some of you are familiar with it on Sound Avenue. The Talmadge family provided land for that, and it's been there for over 100 years now. In addition, there's the Geneva Research Station, upstate New York. They call it Agritech now. It's affiliated with Cornell. The kind of things that have come out of these research institutions are, for example, new varieties of apples. Macintosh, Cortland, McCown, Jonagold, all of these apples came out of the New York State Experiment Station, and they were at one time supported rather well by the New York State legislature. More recently, the legislature has not really kept up with the financing, but still, those research stations are really important. Not only new varieties, research on pesticides. Pesticides are really important for commercial production of most crops. I spoke earlier about Sang Lee, that's a very successful organic grower, and I'm really impressed with what they've done. But the technology really doesn't exist yet for growing fruit, the kind of fruit that we do, apples and peaches and whatnot, organically. I believe it'll come someday, and it'll probably come through the development of varieties that are resistant to mildew or rot, or even resistant to insects. It's already on the way, but it's not in hand yet. And I don't know how soon it may be. Sooner or later, it probably will be. But until that time, we are dependent on judicious use of pesticides to keep production and to keep producing fruit that people want. There's no point in trying to sell premium fruit with worms inside, or they get rotten overnight. There's just no point to that, and we're not in that game. So the technological thing is really important, and it's continuing. And I believe that Long Island, we have this research station we have here, and our cooperative extension team on Long Island is far and away the strongest research team in New York State. Far and away. We've had a research scientist, we've had a pathologist who's worried about diseases, we've had entomologists worried about insects. These are PhD research people right in our community. It's a really important asset to our farming here on Long Island. The second thing I'll mention very briefly, and then I'll turn it over to questions. Government involvement in farming. If you talk to a farmer, 9 farmers out of 10, including in my own family and myself sometimes, government is a problem. And you know, you listen, you read in the newspaper and what a lot of politicians are talking about, government's the problem. Other people say, no, it's a solution. Well, yes, government is a nuisance in some respects, and there are a lot of regulations. This time of year, I'm spending a great deal of time on regulatory matters and worried about all the things that I have to cope. Fortunately, I've got a really good office assistant, stand manager, who is helping me with all of this stuff so I can give a lot of it off to her and more or less it gets done. But let's look at the positive side of what government can do. I mentioned before cooperative extension and these research labs that have promoted and then popularized and helped us understand how this technology could work. I'd like to speak briefly about the land preservation program, a program that got started here in Suffolk County, and that my father was one of the people, one of several, who actually helped launch it and get it going here. And the first, I know many of you know at least broadly about what the program is and how it works, but I'd like to take a minute to describe it, the nuts and bolts of how it works. First of all, it's a voluntary program. Nobody has to participate. But if a landowner wants to participate, he can offer to sell the development rights to his property. What are the development rights? Well, I'll take an example. Suppose land is worth $90,000 an acre. And that's actually a conservative number. That's what a person would pay for it to build a house. Because building a house is the highest value for that property. Well, how much is the agricultural value? How much could a farmer afford to pay for that land and be able to pay for it and make up out of his farming income, out of profits from farming? No way you could afford to buy land at $90,000. Maybe you could afford to pay $40,000 for farming. Okay? The difference is 50. Okay? The landowner will sell to the county or now to the town the difference between those two figures for $50,000 an acre. He or she will be giving up the rights to develop the property. Can never ever develop it in perpetuity, nor can whomever buys it or whoever receives it as a will or through gifts. Never. And the person who still retains ownership of the underlying land must farm it, and it's supposed to always be in some form of farming, and it can never be developed with houses or roads. That's the rule. And this program has actually been really important to farmers out here since it was initiated in the mid-1970s. It has enabled 2 or 3 things. First of all, when farmers get caught in this cycle of losing money, which does happen sometimes, it's a way out to sell the development rights, but still maintain the land that you can continue to farm. And that can help get you out of that hole. The second thing it can do, which is what we have done on our farm, we had 2 farms on either side of us that we didn't own. We were renting land from them, leasing land in and farming it, but we didn't own the land. We, of course, would love to have owned the land, but we could never afford to pay that $90,000 an acre figure. So we approached these 2 different farms at different periods and said, look, we would really like to buy your land. Can we do one of these, participate in this farmland preservation program? And they agreed, and we did. They got the full $90,000, and We paid the $40,000, and the county put in the $50,000, and we owned the land for farming. Of course, we could never sell it as for houses. We could still sell it, but subject to that restriction. So the first thing is for farming to get out of the hole they're in, pay back the banks, and kind of get started again. The second thing is to be able to buy adjacent farms and increase your acreage to a more efficient size. My father actually only had 30-some acres when he started farming. We owned much, my family members owned much more than that, but he had to rent it in from other people. But over the years, we now have roughly 160 acres within the farm itself, plus we have some additional land that we own as individuals. The third thing that is really important in selling the development rights, it finances a shift from a rather extensive way of farming to a more intensive form of farming. Look at the great vineyards out there. They have all of these posts and wires. They have to buy, and I'm in the same boat with apples. We have trellis for all of our apples now. We have the posts and the trellises. We have apple trees that used to be from here to way over there because the trees were so big and so tall. Now they're little teeny trees all in a line. We plant some of our apple trees just as close in the row as tomato plants, 2 or 3 feet apart. So imagine how much that costs. They still cost quite a bit of money, and then all of the trellises. How to finance the transition from an expensive form of, like what potatoes were and some of the other crops are, to a more intensive form of farming. Where is that money going to come from? It is really difficult for farmers to do that. And when they do it, it's usually incremental, just a few acres here or a few acres there. To sell the development rights to a part of your farm, and you don't have to do the whole farm. You can do just part if you want, and do part again later on if you want. Enables some of us to finance the shift from a rather extensive type of farming to a more dynamic and more profitable. There's a lot more I could say, but I think the best and most productive thing.
Very insightful and inspiring presentation. I'm sure all of us have learned a great deal. I wanted to ask, I wanted not to ask one question and ask another question. The question that I'm not going to ask has to do with, from the very beginning when you mentioned Native Americans and the colonizers, the whole issue about land tenure, the complexity of land tenure. And you ended your presentation, which also really discussed questions of land tenure. It's such a complicated subject, and one I would hope that maybe the town of Southold could hold some kind of informed discussion so that we could be an inspiration to other parts of the country regarding this question. The question that I want to ask has to do with where you also began with the glaciers, and that has to do with climate change. And to discuss the issue of climate change with regard to 2 dimensions. One is the impacts that climate change have had over the long period, and the less long period, even your own experience, your own personal experience over decades rather than centuries. But the second also, in terms of climate change, is that the agricultural sector in the country and in the world is a big contributor to climate change, whether it's in husbandry with methane or in other dimensions. The aspect of technology and the way it can mitigate the inputs that the agricultural sector has on climate. I would like to have some thoughts about that.
Well, there's definitely, let me begin by saying climate change has already had quite an impact on farming. In our case, our farm is now subject, just in the last year or so, to diseases of apples, for example, that we never had before as the temperatures get warmer. We've had distinctly warmer temperatures the last few years, and it's now reached the point where fire blight and some of those other diseases are something we have to deal with. I'm not really an authority on the types of industries that contribute to climate change, but fertilizer and the production of fertilizers is really important. Fertilizers are made from nitrogen and it's actually a byproduct of the refining process. Refining of gasoline, diesel fuel, all of that, and as a sideline of that, fertilizer comes out a different pipe. I really don't know what the alternatives are, but fertilizer is very important for Long Island farms. The soils are rather sandy. There are some organic materials you can use. There's some new liquid fertilizers that have kelp and seafood extracts in them that we believe are productive and that to some extent can substitute for nitrogen type fertilizers. But I don't see a substitute for the type of fertilizers that we use in our crops, at least not now. Maybe that'll come in the future. There are people working on it, research people, looking for alternatives to nitrogen fertilizer. But, you know, potatoes always took a lot of fertilizer, and we all put a great deal of fertilizer on potatoes when we grew them. And when we planted apple trees in those fields that formerly had potatoes, those trees just jumped out of the ground. All I can say is that climate change is increasingly important. It's happening. I don't think any one industry can do a whole lot to deal with it. We're getting off, to get off the subject a little bit about farming, what I will say is that the only way to realistically deal with climate change is to get all the major countries in the world to do it together. You can't expect the United States to do this alone if China, India, and a lot of other countries are just not participating.
You know, you mentioned the role of the public sector and government in a constructive way. Well, we just saw billions of dollars being appropriated by the United States government in terms of renewable energy. With the legislation that has come in the course of the last number of months, we now have infrastructure bills and renewable energy. And so my question is, are we seeing any impacts? It's early on, but where in farming, renewables will and are being an important contributor to basically diminishing the carbon footprint of the farming sector.
I guess the question is, do we see any involvement in the new infrastructure bill that will contribute to reducing the impact that farming may have to climate change?
And the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which has billions of dollars.
I'm not aware that there's very much in there for agriculture. There may be some, but I'm really not aware of it. One of the things that they're trying to do, of course, is shift from internal combustion engines into electric engines. And there are now electric tractors on the market. We don't see them, I haven't seen one on Long Island yet, but I'm sure they're coming. Tractors are actually a logical use of electric vehicles because electric vehicles are heavy. They got this big heavy battery. And tractors need to be heavy for traction. So I think it's a logical development that we will see, but I haven't seen much of it yet. Yes, sir.
Just a quick question on the economics of fruit or vegetable
You know what, let me give you
growing.
the microphone, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no problem.
It's on the screen.
Okay, just a quick question on the economics 40 years ago, we had somewhat productive crops, consumption crops out here. I seem to see an awful lot of sod on that, and I see 3 or 4 harvests a year on a typical acre of sod. And to me, it seems like we're just shipping our topsoil out of state as a result. And we seem to have government restrictions on how much acreage we could plant for certain crops. And yet we have sod up the yin yang, and every development is sod, and to maintain a sod lawn, you have to over-fertilize. You're talking 4 applications. So I mean, if we're talking about constructive government policy, I think, but could you just comment on the economics of sod versus vegetables?
Well, the problem is that sod is rather profitable for those farmers who grow it. Sod has become a intermediate, a crop that a farm will lease out to somebody else to grow and get paid for it. So the farmer himself doesn't really do much anymore. He just collects it, so a lease, and then it's going. And then a company, the sod companies, they're the ones who actually do it, and they continue to do it as long as they have a lease on that property. As a landowner, I would not want to be in that business. As an owner of a farm, I really wouldn't want to see the soil depleted in that way. The depletion is not dramatic. In fact, it's relatively small per year. But if you add that up, as you said, several crops a year, and over like 5 or 10 years, it definitely is significant. And you can even see some farms, like at the intersection of Depot Lane and Route 48 is a good example. You can actually see a depression in some of those farms that have been doing it for many, many years. From the point of view of the owner of the property, you would not want to see that. Having said that, when you talk to sod people about it, they will tell you, and I'm not here, I don't know the factual side of it. They'll tell you, yes, we do lose a little bit of soil, but you know what? If you just leave a field untended, it will lose soil through the wind and also through water erosion, and we don't think our losses are any greater than those losses. They'll say that. Yes. The real issue for me for sod is a crop that is grown, it's an opportunist type situation for people who are going out of business. They don't know what to do with their land, and maybe there's no longer a active, able person to actually operate the farm. What are we going to do with it? Here's a sod company dying to lease it.
I have a question here. Okay. Hi, if you could just hold on, I have a question back here.
It seemed like about 30 years ago, we were a very, very rural farmland community in the North Fork, and it seems like in the last 10 years, we've moved into a more urban, more structures, more people. How does that affect the farmer and his future, or his present and his future?
I'm so glad you asked that question. And I'd like to see that question asked at these other growers who also appear in this series. And I think we might have different answers. I want to say I'm really pleased with the neighbors I have in Cutchogue. Our farm is ringed around on all sides by development, by homes and people. It hasn't always been comfortable for them, but I don't feel that those people have been pinched seriously on how we operate our business. Not only that, some of those people have kids who start working with us, and it's their first job, the first jobs they've ever had. I take some satisfaction from being able to offer that kind of employment to kids, to young people. We used to offer it to a lot of adults too, but increasingly, it's hard to find those adults earning just a farm wage and making a go of it in the homes. In addition to that, people who live out here are good consumers. They visit our farm stand. We are doing more business now than we did 10 years ago. They're important consumers, is that the term? They're important in terms of their economic activity in the town. They're even important in paying the 2% transfer tax that finances the preservation program. So I see the people who have come into town of Southold as a plus. Yes, there are always going to be a few problems, but on balance, they're a plus. We have one neighbor who felt that our farming exacerbated her cancer problems. And I said, okay, we will make sure whenever we spray or do anything on your side, that the wind is blowing onto our part of the farm and away from you. And I would even call them up before we spray, just to make sure that they had their windows down and that they were clear to them. She appreciated it. Eventually, she moved away. She just felt, her doctor told her, and she was just worried about it. You're not going to make everybody happy all the time. But farmers have a responsibility. If we expect to continue farming here, we're only a very small number of people. We absolutely have to find a way to live with our neighbors.
I thought that was a really nice balance. I hope you don't mind me commenting as well. I lost the mic. Oh, I wanted to tell you, you mentioned that the Hudson Valley apples, that they grew a really great apple. I think Wickham grows a really great apple too.
Well, they are the same variety.